On the 9th of September 2001, in a remote corner of Afghanistan, Ahmad Shah Massoud, the veteran Mujahideen commander and one of the few remaining opponents of the Taliban, agreed to an interview with two men who claimed to be Belgian journalists. In reality, they were Tunisians trained in the camps of southern Afghanistan. They detonated explosives hidden in their camera, mortally wounding the commander and introducing a new weapon to Afghanistan's already bloody history, the suicide bomb. At the time, it was almost a footnote on the international news agenda. Afghanistan had long been left on the periphery of global politics, a mistake the world was about to regret. Within 48 hours of Massoud's death, 19 men, also trained in the camps of southern Afghanistan, would inflict what remains the greatest single civilian death toll of this millennium. Afghanistan was about to be remembered. With the passing of time, it's easy to forget the consternation with which the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were first met. But even as the world reeled from the aftershock, George W. Bush was already apportioning blame and preparing a response. 9 days later, he addressed the US Congress.
Americans have many questions tonight. Americans are asking, who attacked our country? The evidence we have gathered all points to a collection of loosely affiliated terrorist organizations known as Al-Qaeda. They are some of the murderers indicted for bombing American embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. By sponsoring and sheltering and supplying terrorists, by aiding and abetting murder, the Taliban regime is committing murder. The Taliban must act and act immediately. They will hand over the terrorists, or they will share in their fate.
George W. Bush wasn't the first US president to become interested in Afghanistan. Following the Soviet invasion of 1979, the Ronald Reagan administration had seen an opportunity to settle old scores. By supplying the Afghan resistance, known as the Mujahideen, they kept the Russian wound bleeding for a decade, just as the communists had made the Americans bleed in Vietnam. With the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, US interest waned, and the heavily armed Mujahideen groups, foremost amongst them those of Ahmad Shah Massoud and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, turned on one another, leaving Afghanistan weak and susceptible to the influence of its powerful neighbours.
We had Pakistan supporting Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Iran and Russia were supporting Ahmad Shah Massoud and the Northern Alliance. India, all the neighboring countries were very deeply involved in what was going on.
We should have tried to assist in putting a government together and create conditions for instability, and that did not happen. So I thought we didn't do the right thing by the Afghans in the 90s, and that was a mistake for which the world and ourselves paid a high price given what happened later on.
The civil war left the capital Kabul in ruins and the country divided, poverty-stricken and subject to the law of the gun. This led to the emergence of the Taliban, a religiously conservative and predominantly Pashtun group backed by Pakistan, which fought its way out of Afghanistan's south in 1994. When the Taliban took Kabul 2 years later, the defeated Mujahideen factions, including that of Ahmad Shah Massoud, finally united as the Northern Alliance. but the Taliban now had control of much of the country. To their defenders, the Taliban were the antidote to the poison of the civil war, but their rule was to be uncompromising. They hanged the former communist leaders and imposed a strict interpretation of Islamic law, banning many pastimes popular with ordinary Afghans. After the years of conflict, the rule of law they implemented, however harshly, was initially welcomed by many in Afghanistan and greeted with indifference by the international community.
The United States had, unfortunately, pretty much lost interest in Afghanistan after the defeat of the Soviet Union. It had shifted its focus. It had closed its embassy. So while it wasn't particularly enthusiastic about the Taliban, it wasn't pursuing alternatives. It wasn't seeking to undermine or overthrow the Taliban.
But all that changed after the 1998 bombings of the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. The Taliban had given sanctuary to Osama bin Laden in 1996 and allowed him to set up training camps along the border with Pakistan. US intelligence pointed to bin Laden's responsibility for the bombings, and President Bill Clinton responded by firing more than 70 cruise missiles at the camps and demanding his extradition. But the Americans missed their target and spent the next 3 years trying to reach out to supposedly sympathetic elements within the Taliban. And even in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, these diplomatic efforts continued.
Before the invasion, the U.S. made a request to the Taliban to expel al-Qaeda. The Taliban refused.
But things were not so simple in Afghanistan.
Why did they not give up Osama bin Laden? It is against the Pt1 code to give him up, regardless of what he has done. If a person kills a member of a family and then seeks refuge within that family, the family of the deceased will protect him against everybody else so long as he's under the roof of that family.
Due to fighting, drought, and economic difficulties.
Faced with this dilemma, and with US retaliation imminent, Pakistan sought to broker a deal between its two allies.
Would also eliminate the terrorists who have found safe havens in a war-torn Afghanistan.
Well, Pakistan had been supporting the Taliban. Pakistan did not want to see an American invasion of Afghanistan, and also an American invasion which would bring to power most of the Northern Alliance. In other words, those figures which Pakistan had opposed for the last 15 years. The party of Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks.
Even if the US had been willing to listen to Pakistan, the Northern Alliance was in no mood to compromise after the murder of their commander, Ahmad Shah Massoud. For so long outgunned by the Taliban and their Pakistani allies, with the US now behind them, they smelt blood.
In fact, Massoud was supposed to have been assassinated several weeks earlier. And if he had been assassinated several weeks earlier, the plan was that the Taliban would move up north and sweep away the Northern Alliance fighters, conquer the whole country, and be in control of the whole country when 9/11 happened. And so there would not have been any allies for the Americans on the ground.
On the 8th of October, US air power, directed by American and British Special Forces and supported on the ground by the Northern Alliance, began what had originally been called Operation Infinite Justice, but had now been given the more media-friendly title, Enduring Freedom.
I would not refer to the United States' initial entry into Afghanistan as an invasion. I would call it more as a rescue. Majority of the people were in dire straits, and they welcomed such a rescue.
It's kind of interesting if you think about the day that the last Taliban stronghold fell. There were about 110 CIA officers and about 300 Western Special Forces working in the southern part of Afghanistan. But there were 50,000 Afghans fighting on the side of the coalition against the Taliban. So actually the vast majority of people involved in throwing out the Taliban from Afghanistan were Afghans. And that's what they remember when they talk about it as, our effort to push out the Taliban.
But in this swift and emphatic victory was sown the seeds of future US failure. War light was to be replaced by occupation light. Air power was seen as effective in spite of the inevitable civilian casualties, and short-term pragmatic alliances were to be preferred.
In fact, what you found was that America was working with warlords, with criminals, with anyone who was politically expedient in order to achieve its objectives, and of course, foremost amongst them were the security objectives. And actually, I think the reason why we're in such difficulties today in Afghanistan is because state building was marginalized, neglected in those early years.
Nevertheless, at the beginning of 2002, there was, for the first time in more than 20 years, an unparalleled optimism as Afghans returned to their country from the refugee camps of Pakistan and Iran and from exile in the West.
We were so ecstatic to be back home in Afghanistan that we were making plans and we had visions of grandeur. I was going to bring in the most modern telephone system in Afghanistan. Somebody else came from Germany, they want to bring a canalization to Afghanistan. Others came here for development of agriculture. They all left the country disillusioned.